The morning sun peeked through the windows of Pete's Diner, casting warm golden rays across the checkered floor tiles. It was just another peaceful Tuesday in the small town of Pine Grove, where everyone knew everyone, and the coffee was always fresh and hot. In his usual corner booth, a middle-aged black man sat quietly, enjoying his morning ritual of black coffee and blueberry pancakes. His military-style buzz cut and perfect posture hinted at his past, while the well-worn cane leaning against the wall told a different story of sacrifice and resilience. The regulars at Pete's knew him simply as Chief. He'd earned that nickname not just from his distinguished military career, but from the quiet authority he carried. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd arrive at 7:30 a.m., greet everyone with a gentle nod, and settle into his corner spot where he could observe both the entrance and the street outside, old habits that never quite faded away. Today was no different. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air as the morning crowd trickled in. Old Mrs. Johnson was at the counter, sharing her latest grandkid stories with anyone who'd listen. The high school basketball coach sat nearby, reviewing game plans while dunking his toast in runny eggs. It was the kind of scene that made small-town America feel like home. Chief took another sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. His weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug, fingers tracing the rim, a subtle habit he developed during long nights on watch in faraway places he rarely spoke about. The leg injury that necessitated his cane might have ended his military career, but it hadn't diminished his spirit. Betty, the diner's longtime waitress, stopped by his table with a coffee pot. "More coffee, hon?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Their morning interaction was as reliable as the sunrise. She'd been serving him breakfast for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved to town. While others saw a quiet, disabled veteran, Betty noticed the way he always left generous tips, how he'd shovel the diner's walkway during snowstorms, and how he'd walk her to her car on dark evenings without being asked. The local paper lay folded beside his plate, barely touched. Chief preferred watching people to reading about them. His keen eyes noticed everything: the new couple nervously enjoying their first breakfast date, the tired truck driver grateful for hot coffee after an all-night haul, the young mother trying to keep her toddler from redecorating the floor with scrambled eggs. Through the window, he watched the town wake up. The hardware store owner unlocked his shop across the street. The mail carrier began their daily rounds. A group of joggers passed by, their breath visible in the cool morning air. This peaceful routine had become his anchor after leaving the service, a far cry from the chaos and intensity of his previous life. Little did anyone know that beneath his calm exterior lay the heart of one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in recent history. The same hands that now carefully cut through fluffy pancakes had once conducted some of the military's most dangerous missions. But here, in this small-town diner, he wasn't looking for recognition or glory. He'd found something more valuable: peace, routine, and a community that treated him like family, even if they didn't know his full story. As he finished his breakfast, Chief checked his watch, a habit ingrained from years of military precision. The morning crowd was picking up, and the diner's volume rose with cheerful conversation and the clinking of plates. It was shaping up to be another ordinary day in Pine Grove. But sometimes, as Chief well knew from his years of service, the most extraordinary moments come when you least expect them. None of the breakfast regulars could have guessed that this peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn. The quiet sanctuary of Pete's Diner was about to face a disruption that would reveal exactly who their humble regular customer really was and remind everyone that appearances can be deceiving. The peaceful morning at Pete's Diner shattered like glass when the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. 3 massive bikes pulled up outside, their engines drowning out the gentle music playing from the diner's old jukebox. The morning regulars tensed up. Everyone knew about the steel serpents, and nothing good ever came from their visits. The bell above the door chimed as 3 burly men strutted in, their leather vests covered in patches that screamed trouble. The leader, a giant of a man with a thick beard and weathered face, stood nearly 6.5 feet tall. His arms, covered in faded tattoos, looked like they could bend steel. Behind him, his 2 companions weren't much smaller, their faces set in permanent scowls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Betty, the waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot. Old Mrs. Johnson stopped mid-sentence about her grandchildren, her toast forgotten halfway to her mouth. The high school coach suddenly became very interested in his phone, while a young couple in the corner booth squeezed closer together. The bikers scanned the diner like wolves, sizing up their prey. Their eyes settled on Chief in his corner booth, the only black customer in the establishment. The leader nudged his buddies, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The kind of smile that said he'd found his morning's entertainment. Well, what do we have here?" The leader's voice boomed across the diner, deep and gravelly. His boots thudded heavily against the checkered floor as he approached Chief's table. Each step was deliberate, meant to intimidate. His two companions flanked him, spreading out to block any escape route. Chief continued sipping his coffee, his calm demeanor unchanged. His eyes, however, tracked every movement, every shift in position. Years of training had taught him to notice details others might miss, the slight limp in the leader's walk, the way the youngest biker's hand trembled slightly, the nervous glances the third one kept throwing toward the door. As they reached his table, the leader deliberately knocked into Chief's cane, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the dead-silent diner. "Oops," he sneered, making no move to pick it up. "Guess you'll need help with that, won't you?" His companions snickered, their laughter harsh and forced. The youngest one, trying to prove himself, kicked the cane further away. It slid across the floor, coming to rest near the counter where Betty stood frozen, her hands clutching her order pad like a shield. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows of the three men across Chief's table, like dark clouds blocking out the light. The leader planted his massive hands on the table, leaning down until his face was inches from Chief's. His breath smelled of stale cigarettes and cheaper beer. "You know," the leader growled, "we don't usually see your kind in here." His words dripped with prejudice, designed to provoke a reaction. Behind him, his buddies crossed their arms, trying to look menacing. They were used to people cowering, to seeing fear in their victims' eyes. But Chief's eyes held something different, something that made the youngest biker shift uncomfortably. There was no fear there, no anxiety, not even anger. Instead, there was a calm assessment, like a master chess player studying the board, seeing moves others couldn't imagine. The other customers watched in helpless silence. A few had their phones out, recording discreetly, while others looked away in shame, afraid to get involved. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock above the counter, counting down to what felt like inevitable violence. What nobody in the diner realized was that these three bikers had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They saw a disabled man sitting alone, someone they thought would be an easy target. They didn't see the countless hours of training, the years of combat experience, or the indomitable will that had carried Chief through situations far worse than this. The morning was about to take a turn that none of the steel serpents could have anticipated. Their attempt at bullying was about to backfire in a way that would become a lasting legend in their small town. The next few moments would prove that appearances can be deceiving, and that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. The diner had become a pressure cooker, with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Betty's hands shook as she watched from behind the counter, her years of serving tough customers doing nothing to prepare her for this moment. Chief's cane still lay on the floor, a symbol of the disrespect these men had brought into their peaceful morning sanctuary. "Could you please return my cane?" Chief's voice was steady and polite, carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of giving orders in life-or-death situations. He gestured toward the walking stick with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. The biker gang leader threw his head back and laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Oh, listen to that, boys," he said, "please." His companions joined in with forced laughter, but the youngest one's eyes kept darting between Chief and the door, as if something about the situation wasn't sitting right with him. "Tell you what," the leader continued, pulling out a chair and sitting down uninvited at Chief's table, "maybe we'll give it back if you get up and dance for us." He spread his arms wide, grinning at his own cruel joke. The coffee cups on the table rattled as he deliberately bumped it with his knee. The other customers in the diner had gone completely still, like prey animals hoping a predator wouldn't notice them. The young couple in the corner booth were holding hands under their table, the girl's knuckles white from squeezing so hard. Old Mrs. Johnson had tears in her eyes, her motherly heart breaking at the scene unfolding before her. The high school coach had his phone out now, recording everything. He'd dealt with bullies in his years of teaching, but this was different. Something in the air told him this wasn't going to end the way these bikers thought it would. "I'm going to ask one more time," Chief said calmly, placing his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Please return my cane, and then you gentlemen can go about your day." His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of a final warning. The second biker, a man with a scraggly red beard, stepped forward and kicked at Chief's breakfast plate, sending scrambled eggs sliding across the table. "Or what?" he sneered, trying to match his leader's bravado. "What's a crippled man gonna do about it?" Chief's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Anyone who had seen combat would have recognized that look, the calm focus of a trained warrior assessing threats and planning moves. His hands remained relaxed on the table, but his shoulders squared ever so slightly. Betty, still behind the counter, remembered something she'd seen months ago. She'd been working late one night when some drunk teenagers had been causing trouble outside. Chief had stepped out to talk to them, and something in his presence alone had made those rowdy kids straighten up and apologize. She'd never seen anything like it. The leader leaned in closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the table. "Maybe we need to teach you about respect," he growled, his words carrying the stench of his morning cigarettes. "Seems like you need a lesson in knowing your place." The youngest biker suddenly spoke up, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Boss, maybe we should just," but he was cut off by a sharp look from the leader. The kid knew something wasn't right here, but peer pressure and fear kept him in line. Outside, the morning had grown darker as clouds rolled in, as if nature itself was setting the stage for what was about to happen. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scene. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second bringing them closer to the moment when everything would change. Chief glanced around the diner, taking in the scared faces of the other customers. In all his years of service, he'd fought to protect people like this, ordinary folks just trying to enjoy their morning coffee. He'd faced down threats far worse than 3 bullies with more attitude than sense, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't in some far-off land, he was in his own community. The tension in the room was about to snap. Nobody knew it yet, but these bikers were seconds away from learning a lesson they'd never forget. The quiet man they'd chosen to bully was about to show them why appearances can be the most deceiving thing of all. The morning light filtering through the diner's windows seemed to dim, as if even the sun was holding its breath. Chief's coffee cup sat half empty on the table, the dark liquid inside perfectly still despite the tension surrounding it. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the aggressive posturing of the 3 bikers towering over him. "You know what?" the leader growled, reaching for Chief's coffee cup. "I don't think you need this anymore." With a cruel smile, he lifted the cup and slowly poured the coffee across the table, creating a dark river that dripped onto the floor. The hot liquid steamed in the cool air of the diner, forming little clouds that rose between them like signals of an approaching storm. But Chief remained motionless, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of special operations training had taught him to control his heart rate even in the most stressful situations. Right now, his pulse was as steady as it had been during morning coffee. His eyes, however, never stopped moving, taking in every detail: the distance to the door, the position of each biker, the locations of all the civilians in the diner. The high school coach, still recording everything on his phone, noticed something odd. Despite being seated and without his cane, the veteran's posture had subtly changed. There was a coiled energy about him now, like a spring being slowly compressed. The coach had seen that look before, in state championship matches when an underestimated wrestler was about to turn the tables. Betty, the waitress, had inched closer to the phone behind the counter. Her fingers hovered over the numbers, ready to call for help. But something in Chief's expression made her pause. In 3 years of serving him breakfast, she'd never seen him lose his composure, not even when the kitchen mixed up his order or when rowdy teenagers spilled soda near his table. "You don't have to do this," Chief said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent diner. "There's still time to walk away, gentlemen. No harm done." Despite the coffee dripping off his table, his words carried no anger, only a sense of finality, like a teacher giving students one last chance to correct their behavior. The red-bearded biker laughed, but it sounded forced. Something about the veteran's calmness was starting to unnerve him. People they intimidated usually showed fear by now. They shouted, they cried, they begged. But this man just sat there, looking at them like he was solving a simple math problem. The youngest biker took a small step back, his instincts finally overriding his desire to fit in with the gang. He'd grown up watching action movies, and something about this scene felt familiar, but not in the way his leader expected. They weren't looking like the heroes right now. Last chance, the leader snarled, trying to hide his growing uncertainty behind bravado. He planted both hands on the coffee-stained table and leaned forward until his face was inches from Chief's. "Get up and walk out of here. Oh wait, you can't walk without your stick, can you?" A faint smile flickered across Chief's face, not one of amusement, but of recognition. It was the kind of smile that had preceded some of his most successful missions, the calm before a storm that his enemies never saw coming. His hands remained relaxed on the table, but his feet had shifted slightly, finding solid purchase on the floor. The diner's other customers watched in fearful fascination. The young couple had stopped eating entirely, their breakfast growing cold. Old Mrs. Johnson had her hands clasped as if in prayer. Through the window, a few passers-by had noticed the scene unfolding inside, some already pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The air in the diner grew heavier with each passing second. The leader's attempt to maintain his intimidating stance was beginning to waver. Something about this disabled veteran's unwavering calm had started to make him question his choices. It was like trying to intimidate a brick wall, except this wall seemed to be studying him right back. What none of the bikers realized was that they weren't looking at a disabled veteran having a bad morning. They were staring into the eyes of a man who had faced down threats that would make their little intimidation act look like a children's game. A man who had been trained to remain calm in situations far worse than this, who had learned to turn seemingly disadvantageous positions into opportunities. The next few moments would teach these bikers a lesson they'd never forget, and it wouldn't be the one they came here to deliver. The quiet morning at Pete's Diner was about to become a story that would be told in their small town for years to come. The bell above the diner's door chimed, cutting through the tension like a knife. Every head turned to see a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s step inside. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and carried himself with military bearing. The newcomer took one look at the scene before him and shook his head slowly, a knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. Well, the newcomer said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Of all the diners in all the towns, you boys picked the wrong one to cause trouble in." He walked forward with measured steps, his shoes clicking against the checkered floor. The bikers turned to face him, momentarily distracted from their intended victim. "This isn't your business, old man," the leader growled, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice now. Something about the newcomer's confidence made him uneasy. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, but it is my business when I see three grown men trying to intimidate one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in recent history." He stopped a few feet away from the group, hands clasped behind his back. "You see, I'm Commander Wilson, and that man you're trying to bully. He served under my command." The youngest biker's face went pale. The red-bearded one took a half-step back. Their leader tried to maintain his tough guy act, but his swagger had visibly deflated. "Let me tell you a little story," the commander continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent diner. "A few years back, our team was pinned down in a valley in Afghanistan. Enemy fire coming from all directions. 2 of our men were badly wounded. We thought that was it, our last mission." He paused, looking directly at Chief with respect in his eyes. "But this man right here, the one whose cane you knocked away?" He moved through enemy fire like a ghost, took out 3 sniper positions, created an escape route, and carried both wounded men to safety, all with a bullet in his own leg. The other customers in the diner listened in stunned silence. Betty had her hand over her mouth. The high school coach was still recording, his phone slightly shaking. Even old Mrs. Johnson had stopped dabbing at her tears to listen. "That medal ceremony at the White House," the commander went on, "the one that made national news but kept the hero's identity classified. You're looking at him, the man who saved not just my life, but the lives of every member of our team multiple times." The leader of the bikers had started sweating now. His earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew in the sun. He looked down at the coffee he'd spilled, then at the cane on the floor, suddenly seeing his actions in a very different light. "But here's the really interesting part," Commander Wilson said, taking another step forward. "What he did in combat, that's not even the most impressive thing about him. It's what he does every day since then that shows his true character. Never complains about his injury. Never brags about his achievements. Just quietly helps people in this community, asking nothing in return." Chief remained seated, still calm, still composed. But now everyone in the diner could see him differently. The quiet strength they'd always sensed in him suddenly had context. The way he carried himself, the alertness in his eyes, it all made sense. "So," the commander concluded, his voice heartening slightly, "you gentlemen have a choice to make, and I suggest you make it carefully. Because while my friend here is the most disciplined, honorable man I know, he's also the last person on earth I'd want to provoke." The young couple in their booth had stopped holding hands and were now recording with both their phones. The morning sun had broken through the clouds again, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Every eye in the diner darted between the bikers and Chief, waiting to see what would happen next. The revelation hung in the air like thunder after lightning, changing everything about how they saw their regular morning customer. The quiet man who always had a kind word for everyone, who helped Betty carry heavy trays without being asked, who taught the owner's kid math after school, he wasn't just a disabled veteran. He was a genuine American hero. The next move belonged to the bikers, and everyone in Pete's diner held their breath to see what they would choose. The morning had become a moment of truth, not just for the troublemakers, but for everyone watching. It was a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just quietly drink their coffee in the corner booth, waiting for the moment when they're truly needed. The atmosphere in Pete's diner had transformed completely. The morning sun streaming through the windows felt warmer now, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where the roles had suddenly reversed. The three bikers who had strutted in like kings of their small-town kingdom now looked more like schoolboys caught in the principal's office. Chief slowly rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. Even without his cane, he stood tall and steady, his powerful frame becoming apparent beneath his simple flannel shirt. The leader of the bikers, who had seemed so imposing just moments ago, now appeared to shrink in comparison. The young biker, who'd been uncertain from the start, was the first to show genuine remorse. His face had turned the color of the untouched toast on a nearby plate, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. The reality of who they'd been trying to intimidate was hitting him hard. "3 Purple Hearts," Commander Wilson continued, his voice carrying pride and respect. "The Silver Star. Countless classified missions that saved American lives. And here you are, pouring his coffee on the table." He shook his head slowly, letting the weight of their actions sink in. The red-bearded biker kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, trying to find words that wouldn't come. His earlier tough guy act had melted away, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they'd picked a fight they couldn't possibly win. Betty, still behind the counter, noticed something remarkable. Chief's posture hadn't changed into an aggressive stance. He still stood with the same quiet dignity he showed every morning. But now everyone could see the strength that had always been there, like finally noticing a lion that had been quietly sitting among house cats. The high school coach, who'd been recording everything, couldn't help but whisper to the person next to him, "My kids need to hear this story." He was already thinking about the lessons in character and judgment he could share with his team. Old Mrs. Johnson had stopped crying now. Instead, she sat up straighter in her booth, her chin lifted with pride. She'd been serving Chief pie and coffee for 3 years, and now she felt like she'd been serving dessert to a real-life superhero all along. The diner's owner had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron as he watched the scene unfold. He remembered how Chief had helped him fix his delivery truck one rainy Sunday, never mentioning his military background or complaining about his injured leg. Just quietly doing what needed to be done. The biker gang leader tried one last time to salvage his dignity. "We didn't know," he started, but his voice trailed off weakly. The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "That's the point," Chief spoke, his voice steady and clear. "You never know who people are or what battles they fought. That's why decent folks treat everyone with respect." His words carried no anger, just the simple truth of a lesson learned the hard way. The young couple who'd been recording everything had completely forgotten about their breakfast. They watched with wide eyes as history unfolded in their local diner. This would be a story they'd tell their kids someday, about judging books by their covers and the quiet heroes walking among us. Through the diner's windows, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Word spreads fast in small towns, and people had started filming through the glass. They'd come to witness what would surely become a local legend, the day the Steel Serpents learned about real strength. The bikers' motorcycles seemed to gleam a little less proudly in the parking lot now. Their chrome and leather, meant to intimidate, looked more like costume pieces in a play that had gone terribly wrong for its actors. Commander Wilson stepped closer to his former teammate, their shared history visible in the way they stood together, brothers forged in combat, reunited in this unexpected moment. The coffee still dripped slowly off the table edge, but now it seemed to mark the seconds of the biker's crumbling bravado. The transformation was complete. What had started as an attempt to bully a disabled man had become a powerful lesson about appearance versus reality. The quiet veteran they'd mistaken for an easy target stood before them as a living legend, his achievements made more impressive by his humility in never flaunting them. The morning light had shifted in Pete's diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. The tension in the air had changed from threatening to expectant as everyone waited to see how this unexpected story would end. Chief stood tall despite his injury, looking at the three bikers with steady eyes that had seen far worse situations than this. "Here's what's going to happen," Chief said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being obeyed. "You're going to pick up my cane, clean up this coffee mess, and then we're going to have a conversation about respect." The youngest biker moved first, practically running to retrieve the cane from where it had skidded across the floor. He wiped it carefully with his bandana before offering it back to Chief with trembling hands. His eyes couldn't meet the veteran's gaze, fixed instead on the purple heart pin on Chief's jacket that nobody had noticed before. Betty appeared with cleaning supplies, but the red-bearded biker quickly took them from her hands. "We'll do it, ma'am," he said quietly, his gruff voice now tinged with shame. He and the young biker began mopping up the spilled coffee, their leather vests brushing against the floor as they worked. The gang leader stood frozen, his massive frame seeming to deflate with each passing second. The same hands that had so confidently caused trouble minutes ago now hung uselessly at his sides. His face showed the struggle between his pride and the overwhelming realization of his mistake. "You know," Commander Wilson said, pulling up a chair, "the interesting thing about Navy SEALs is they don't just train you to fight. They train you to think, to judge situations, to show mercy when it's deserved." He gestured to the empty seats at the now clean table. "Sit down, gentlemen. It's time for a lesson that doesn't involve fists." The other customers in the diner watched in amazement as the three bikers, who had strutted in like kings, meekly took their seats. Old Mrs. Johnson quietly ordered coffee for everyone, her weathered hands shaking slightly as she handed money to Betty. "On me," she whispered. "I want to be part of this." Chief eased back into his seat, placing his cane carefully beside him. "First thing they teach you in the teams," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly attentive diner, "is that strength isn't about intimidation, it's about protection, about standing up for what's right." The high school coach had stopped recording, but he sat nearby, hanging on every word. He knew this was the kind of lesson his students needed to hear, about real strength, real courage, and real character. Through the windows, the gathered crowd watched in respectful silence. The morning sun caught the chrome of the motorcycles outside, but somehow they didn't look as menacing anymore. They seemed more like props in a play that had taken an unexpected turn toward redemption. "You came in here thinking you saw weakness," Chief continued, taking a sip from the fresh coffee Betty had brought. "But let me tell you what I see. I see three men with the potential to be better than this, to use their strength to help people instead of scaring them." The young biker wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide the tears that had formed. The red-bearded one stared into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to questions he'd never thought to ask before. Their leader sat straight, finally meeting Chief's eyes with something new in his expression, respect. "So here's your choice," Chief said, leaning forward slightly. You can leave here the same men who walked in, or you can leave here changed. You can keep trying to look strong by making others feel weak, or you can learn what real strength looks like. The diner had fallen so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking above. The young couple who'd been on their first date were holding hands again, but now they were leaning forward, witnessing a moment of transformation they'd never forget. The biker leader cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. I've never had anyone show mercy like this. Anyone turn a moment of hate into a lesson about being better. He looked at his companions, then back at Chief. We choose to change. As the morning sun rose higher over the small town, Pete's Diner became more than just a breakfast spot. It became a place where a story of redemption was born, where three men learned that true strength lies not in causing fear, but in showing wisdom, mercy, and the courage to change. The regulars who witnessed that morning would tell the story for years to come, not just about a decorated Navy SEAL who stood up to bullies, but about a moment when hatred turned to understanding, when fear transformed into respect, and when a quiet breakfast spot became sacred ground for second chances.